This is the weakest Intel Mac Apple ever created, and I'm downgrading it further than anyone before to make it even worse. The 2006 Mini was the only Intel Mac released with an Intel Core Solo CPU option, with just one core running at 1.66 GHz. This one has 2GB of DDR2 memory running at 667 MHz. There's 60GB of hard drive space on a 5400 RPM SATA drive. Because it's such an early Intel Mac though, there's incredible upgradability, or in our case, downgradability. I'm putting in a 1.46 GHz Intel Celeron. Again, a single-core CPU. It released in 2006 and was built on 65nm lithography with a 27W TDP. By the way, this was before turbo boosting came along, so 1.46 GHz really is all we're getting. Did I mention it's a 32-bit processor? I'm also giving this machine the slowest RAM any Intel Mac can support, if it even boots that is, since almost no one has ever tried this. I'm going with a single stick of DDR2 400MHz RAM. For reference, current machines support speeds of well above 6000 MHz. This thing might run from a horrible 5400 RPM hard drive right now, but we can do far worse than that. I'm going to try using a 4200 RPM drive. Let's hope the OS is usable at very least. Just for the record, this computer works perfectly right now, as you can see. We're running OS X 10.6 Snow Leopard. Of course, once the parts are in, I'm going to try opening apps and I'll show you guys how performance is on the whole. First though, let's get into the downgrades. I'm starting with the RAM. Unfortunately, there's no easy way to open the case of one of these. There are a dozen or so clips holding the case together, which I'm just pushing open with a screwdriver. With the case open, we can see just how much Apple crammed into such a small footprint. There's a DVD drive as well as all your standard mini PC parts. I had to follow a guide to disassemble the Mac down to the RAM since it's pretty cryptic to get into. Better to do it right than to damage anything, anyway. With the two biggest parts of the internals split apart, I was free to take out the memory modules in place. There were two 1GB sticks of 667 MHz memory in there. Time to put the 400 MHz stuff in. I'll spare you from watching me put it all back together, but let's pray it actually boots. There you go, straight away it starts up, and pretty much as usual too. Weird to see such ridiculously low specs on that memory in about this Mac. Something I didn't catch on camera was every few times I booted the Mac up with the slower memory, the boot chime would just kind of cut itself short, and it sounded distorted. Really odd, but I guess we're in uncharted territory now anyway. Back to taking this thing apart again. Now it's time for a CPU change-up. This was the weirdest cooler I've ever had to take off, since it had kind of plastic clips attached to the back of the motherboard. I had to squeeze them and push them through the front of the board, if that makes sense. Under the cooler was a very dry portion of thermal paste. It's 18 years old now, so what can you expect, I guess. Socketed CPUs on machines like this are incredible. Yes, today we're downgrading, but being able to replace older parts with newer, faster ones is a brilliant feature of computers with socketed CPUs, RAM and hard drives like this one. You can buy a new Mac Mini right now for $600, and it will blitz any Intel Mac around. Without any socketed and replaceable parts though, it's going to have the same, normally tiny RAM and storage size for the rest of its days. Not to mention the CPU won't ever see an upgrade like this one could. Anyway, back to the CPU at hand. Once I've dropped the Intel Celeron 410 inside, it's time to put everything back the way it was again, and I hope it works. Excellent news. It does. Another pretty normal startup here. In a pretty stupid pattern of thinking though, I seem to have underestimated just how bad the world's worst Intel Mac might be. It's already struggling to just open the apps built into OS X Snow Leopard. Anyway, after a glance at the old About This Mac screen, it's time to try getting the 4200 RPM hard drive inside. In order for the Mac to boot properly, I ideally need the contents of the old hard drive cloned onto the new one. Thankfully, there's an incredibly useful bit of software called Carbon Copy Cloner that can do this for me. I'll spare you the headache of watching every hour I put into cloning the disks, but trust me, this wasn't easy. Carbon Copy Cloner didn't want to work on my M1 Mac, so I had to put both the drives inside my 2010 Mac Pro and try again. I obviously needed to format the new disk correctly, as well as use the oldest available version of Carbon Copy Cloner to copy the installation of OS X Snow Leopard. Done. Finally. I wish I could say getting the new disk drive inside was easier than the disk cloning. It wasn't. It turns out the 4200 RPM drive was about 5mm thicker than the original one. Normally that's not a problem, but due to the size constraints of the Mac Mini, it wouldn't fit inside. I ended up having to remove a small bit of plastic from the frame. After that, the hard drive went in, albeit at a slight slant. Now time to see whether this last downgrade would finally kill our little computer. So the Mac booted the moment I plugged the power cable in, which is not normally a good sign after you've undertaken a repair. There were no problems at boot though. The disk had been cloned flawlessly, and the speed was enough for the OS to come to life. So there we have it. macOS seems to think the Intel Celeron is a Core Solo. That makes sense though, since they never shipped a Celeron model. We know it's a Celeron though, and a weak one at that. Our 0.5 GB of 400 MHz RAM is no doubt working very hard too. Hardest working of all though, perhaps, is the 4200 RPM hard drive. Opening an app included in the OS like Safari is an 11-second task at this point. Safari won't work with certain websites because of how old the version is. Because of this, I actually gave Chrome a go. I actually expected the download speed to be a bit worse, really. Here you can see how ridiculously slow it was to install it though. In the end, it wasn't worth it at all. I kept getting this message saying the Google servers couldn't be reached, basically. I could try getting software onto here from Macintosh Garden or other sites where older software is available. There's actually a fair bit of stuff already on here though. Let's take Microsoft Word 2011 for a spin. Give it a few seconds to load. And a few more. Well, it's safe to say Word 2011 is working pretty much fine. The recurring theme here is that the system is actually pretty stable. It hasn't crashed on me yet, and the OS is functioning as it should. It's just super slow. All this footage might as well be a slow motion capture of something more modern. It's actually quite impressive because Snow Leopard is one of those OSs that doesn't push the hardware inside your Mac very hard at all. It was released in 2009, just 3 years after the 2006 Mac Mini. So I don't know who would expect anything else from such a pitiful machine, but yeah, very slow, very horrible to use. I worry slightly that this video won't be particularly interesting to those interested in newer Macs. This video took me almost 2 weeks of evenings to make though. If you'd like to see me trying to run some games on this thing, leave a comment down below. I'm sure to make a follow-up video on this in the very near future, so get subscribed to see more of the same. Just a couple of things I've learned from this video. 1. 400 MHz memory was used in the first generation Apple TV from 2007, and that barely ran OS X versions from past 2008. 2. The Mac Mini doesn't seem as tightly fit for space these days, but back in 2006, putting this kind of computing power in a machine of this size really was a big thing. I was continually impressed while working on it just how cleverly Apple had to fit this thing together like Lego. 3. There's some weird foreshadowing going on with the power connector here. The old Mac Mini power supply looks identical to USB Type-C, just roughly twice the size. Strange to think that this was almost 2 decades before they fully adopted USB Type-C. Like I said, more content on this old thing to come, but for now, thank you very much for watching. Subscribe for more and join the Discord server if you are a fan of older technology in general. I'll see you next week.